My name is Cora, and I was 33 the night my father decided I had stopped being his daughter. We were at the rehearsal dinner. White tablecloths, the good wine, his business friends seated where family should have been, and he stood up with his glass and said, in front of all of them, "If you marry that grease-stained nobody, you walk out of here with nothing. No trust. No name. Don't expect to still be a thorn in the morning." Daniel, beside me in the one good jacket he owned, set down his fork and said, very quietly, "That's all right, sir." I remember my hands going flat against the tablecloth, the whole long table holding its breath. I didn't argue. I'd learned a long time ago that the people who shout loudest about what you're worth are usually the ones who never once thought to look. What my father had never thought to ask, not in 2 years, was what the man he just called a nobody had actually built with those grease-stained hands. 8 months later, he would find out, in a room with 400 people in it, and he would not be able to look away. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the truth do the talking. If a story like this finds you at the right time, do me a favor, leave a comment, hit subscribe, and stay to the end, because the end is where it all turns. I should tell you about the family first, because none of what happened later makes sense unless you understand how the thorns measured a person. My father is Roland Thorne, and if you live in Tacoma, you have stood inside a building he put up without ever knowing his name was on the paperwork. Thorne Development took raw lots along the Foss Waterway and the old mill flats and turned them into glass and money. He started with a single strip of failing warehouses and a loan he liked to remind us he had paid back 2 years early, and by the time I was grown he had an office on the top floor of a building with his own name etched into the lobby stone. He was not a cruel man in the way movies teach you to expect cruelty. He never raised a hand and rarely raised his voice. He was something quieter and harder than that. He believed, all the way down to the floor of himself, that a person's value could be read off the surface of their life, the car, the address, the title on the business card, and that anyone who failed to display value simply didn't have any to display. My mother, Diane, agreed with him the way a mirror agrees with a face. My older sister, Whitney, was the living proof that the system worked. She married a man named Preston who ran a wealth management office downtown. She lived in a house with a circular drive and a lawn that someone else mowed, and she had learned by the age of 10 to walk into any room and locate the most important person in it within about 4 seconds. When Whitney brought a man home, my father shook his hand the way he shook hands at a closing, firm, appraising, already counting. When I brought anyone home, his eyes went to their shoes. I remember being 12 and winning the County Math League, the individual round, a little gold-colored medal on a cheap ribbon. I'd practiced for months at the kitchen table while Whitney was at her tennis lessons. I brought the medal home and set it by my father's plate at dinner because I wanted, just once, to be the interesting one. He picked it up, turned it over, said, "That's nice, sweetheart," and then asked Whitney how the regional tournament had gone, because there be scouts there and scouts mattered. The medal sat by my plate for the rest of the meal. I put it in a drawer that night, and I don't think anyone ever asked about it again. That's not a story about a villain. It's a story about a man who genuinely could not see a thing that didn't shine, and who had raised an entire family inside that blindness. Holidays were the worst of it, because holidays were when the measuring went public. Every Thanksgiving my father ran the table like a shareholders' meeting, going around for everyone's news, and the news was always graded, even if he would never in his life have called it grading. Whitney's news drew follow-up questions. Mine drew, "That's good, that's steady," and a move on to the next person. One year I had just taken on the clinic's books and kept them from shuttering a children's program for lack of $40,000 they didn't know they were quietly losing, and I tried to tell that at the table, and my father listened with real patience and then said, kindly, "It's nice that you're helping out down there," as though I had manned a folding table at a bake sale, and turned to ask Preston about the markets. I wasn't helping out. I was keeping a clinic breathing with a spreadsheet, but there was no column in my father's ledger for that kind of worth, so it simply didn't post, and I want to be fair to him, because it wasn't that he discounted it. It's that he genuinely could not see it, the way you can't see a color your eyes don't have the cells to catch. I used to drive home from those dinners with my jaw aching from holding my face still. At the long red light on the way, I'd set my grandmother's green ledger in my lap and rest my hand flat on the cover and remind myself that one person who'd carried this name had known how to look. It got me through more of my 20s than I would like to admit. I was the other kind of thorn, the quiet kind. I was good with numbers in a way nobody in my family found impressive because numbers don't catch the light. I went to a state school my father didn't mention at his parties, and I became a bookkeeper, not a glamorous accountant in a firm with a marble lobby, but the kind who keeps the real books for small businesses that would otherwise drown in their own receipts. I rented a one-bedroom up on the north end with a slice of water view if you leaned out the window, drove a 9-year-old hatchback, and I was, by my family's arithmetic, the disappointment who had simply declined to become anything. I want to be honest about that because for a long stretch of years, I half believed it myself. My clients didn't, though. There was Marisol, who ran a panaderia down on 6th that made the best conscious in the city and could not, to save her life, tell the difference between profit and cash flow. I found 11 months of a double-charged merchant fee in her statements once, got it refunded, and she cried and tried to pay me in bread for a year. There was the free clinic over on Hilltop whose books I did at cost because somebody had to, and whose director once told me I was the only person who'd ever made her feel like the money wasn't going to swallow the mission. There was Hector, who ran a landscaping crew and could read a property line in his sleep but broke into a sweat at a balance sheet, and who trusted me with a company checkbook because, he said, I was the only person he'd ever met who got more careful when the numbers got bigger. That was my life. Small, unglamorous, and, though no thorn would ever have used the word, honest in a way that cost me something every single day at family dinners. It cost me a client once, too, in a way I have never once regretted. A man named Vic opened a steakhouse downtown on a great deal of borrowed money and considerably more confidence than sense, and 3 months in he sat me down and asked me, very reasonably, very warmly, whether there wasn't some way to present the first quarter so the numbers read stronger for the bank. Nothing dishonest, he said. Just optimistic. He had a watch that cost more than my car, and a way of leaning across the table like the two of us were already in on it together. I told him no. He told me everybody did it. I told him I didn't, packed my laptop into its bag, and drove home $1,100 a month poorer, with my grandmother's voice in my ear asking whether I was the kind of person who'd let a thing be wrong because nobody was watching. Vic's Steakhouse closed inside the year. I don't tell you that because it makes me a saint. It doesn't. I tell you because it's the cleanest example I have of the gap my family could never see. A man in a $1,000 watch had asked me to lie, and a man with grease worked permanently into his knuckles had once knocked $60 off an invoice over a weld nobody on earth would ever have caught. The price tag and the thing. They are not the same. They were never the same. Because there's a particular tiredness that settles into your chest when the people who are supposed to love you keep waiting for you to start mattering. My throat used to tighten before I'd even said anything, just from anticipating the gentle correction. Whitney would describe 2 weeks in Tuscany, and my mother would turn to me, with real warmth, and ask whether I'd thought any more about that opportunity Preston mentioned. There was always an opportunity. There was always the sense that my actual life was a waiting room I'd been sitting in too politely to leave. The one person who never once made me feel that way was my grandmother. Not a thorn by temperament. She'd married into the name and kept every one of her own opinions. Grandma Halvorsen had hands like worn saddle leather and a way of looking at you that felt like being weighed by someone who didn't already know the answer. She and my grandfather had run a hardware store down in the valley for 40 years, and she kept the books herself, in pencil, in a green cloth-bound ledger she guarded like scripture. I used to spend Saturdays on a stool behind her counter while she reconciled the till. One afternoon the drawer came up 11 cents short, and I told her it was 11 cents. It didn't matter. We could go home. She looked at me over her glasses and kept her pencil moving. It's not the 11 cents, Cora, she said. It's whether you're the kind of person who'll let 11 cents be wrong, because nobody's watching. We found it, a transposed figure, a 4 written like a 7, 40 minutes later, and she let me be the one to fix it. Then she made me tea and told me the thing I've carried ever since. Most people in this world, she said, spend their whole lives confusing the price tag with a thing. A man can wear a $400 shirt and not be worth the thread that's in it. And another man can walk in here with grease under his nails and be the only honest soul in the building. You learn to tell the difference, and you'll never be poor a day in your life, no matter what's in your account. She died when I was 26. I kept the green ledger. It's on my shelf still, the way some people keep a saint's medal. So that was me, going into my 30s. The daughter who kept other people's books, who'd been told, kindly and constantly, that she'd somehow missed the entire point of being a thorn. And then I met Daniel. I met him because Hector's flatbed threw a wheel bearing and he set me to settle the repair invoice in person, since he trusted me with cash more than he trusted himself with it. The shop was called Vance Fabrication, out on the Tide Flats, and it sat on a lot that smelled like cut metal and burnt coffee, and something mineral I came to love before I could name it. I expected a front desk and a bored teenager. What I got was a man in coveralls with a torque wrench still in one hand, who wiped his palm on a rag before he shook mine, looked at Hector's invoice for about 4 seconds, and then quietly knocked $60 off it because, he said, "The second bracket was our miss, not yours. Wouldn't be right to charge you for our own bad weld." His hands were stained dark in the creases no soap was ever going to reach. His handshake was the steadiest thing I'd felt in a decade. We ended up talking for 40 minutes about nothing. About Marisol's conscience, which it turned out he also drove across town for, about why people are weird about rain, about his grandfather, and I drove home with a strange physical sense that something in my chest had quietly unclenched for the first time in years. Daniel Vance liked working with his hands the way other people like breathing. He could have sat behind a desk. I would learn, much later and all at once, exactly how true that was. But he told me early, leaning against that flat bed with his arms crossed, that a man ought to be able to point at something real at the end of a day and say, "I made that." The shop was his grandfather's first. Old Gus Vance had come back from the service in the 50s with a welding certificate and a stubborn conviction that this city was going to need steel, and he'd built a fabrication business one beam at a time, out of a single rented bay. By the time Gus handed it down, Vance Fab had put the bones into hospitals, bridges, schools, the parts of a city nobody photographs and everybody trusts with their lives. Gus had a ritual, and Daniel still kept it. Every major structural piece that left the floor got a small mark pressed into it by hand near the base, AV inside a gear. The Vance stamp, struck with a worn steel die older than my father's company. So, when somebody's tearing it down in 80 years, Gus used to tell the crew, they know a person made it, not a machine. A person stood here and got it right. Daniel showed me the die the third time I came around, dropped it into my open palm like it was nothing, this little blunt chunk of steel that had pressed the family name into more of the city than anyone driving past would ever guess. It was so much heavier than it looked. Most true things are. He took me on what I suppose was our third real date to see a building. Not a restaurant, not a movie, a building. It was a parking structure down by the stadium, of all the unromantic things in the world, and he parked across the street, and we ate tacos out of the bag on the warm hood of his truck while he told me about it. Vance had done the steel on it 9 years before, back when he was first taking the shop over from Gus, and wasn't sure he could carry the weight of the name. He pointed up at the third level, at a long run of beam you would never look at twice in your life, and told me there'd been a problem on that job. A supplier had sent a batch of steel with a mill certificate that didn't quite match the metal, the kind of mismatch nobody would ever catch until the one day it mattered, which is the day it fails. He'd caught it. He had shut the entire job down for 3 weeks and eaten the cost himself rather than set one bad beam, and it had very nearly broken the company in his first year holding the reins. "Everybody told me I'd lost my mind," he said, around a taco, looking up at it. Gus was gone. I had Sal and Eddie and 40 other people's paychecks riding on me, and there I was shutting down a job over steel that looked fine. He shrugged. But it wasn't fine. And there are about 900 cars parked up on that level right now, and every one of them belongs to somebody. I looked at him looking up at his beam in the dark, grease still in the creases of his hands from the day, and I understood that I was sitting beside the single most substantial person I had ever met, and that not one member of my family would have been able to see it if you'd sat them down exactly where I was sitting. My grandmother would have. My grandmother would have married him on the spot. Something in my chest had gone warm and steady and certain, and it never did go back. I started spending my evenings out at the shop after that, once my client books were closed for the day, just to be near him. I learned the place by its sounds before I learned it by its people. The bright shriek of the saw, the fat hiss of the welders, the clean church bell tone a good beam gives off when you tap it right. Daniel introduced me around like I mattered, which was a courtship all its own. There was Sal, who had been welding at Vance Fab for 31 years and could lay a bead so clean it looked drawn with a straight edge. He had forearms like mooring lines and a habit of calling me bookkeeper as a term of the deepest respect, because in Sal's view the people who counted the money honestly were every bit as rare and as load-bearing as the people who welded the steel honestly. There was Eddie, quieter than Sal, who had come up under Gus himself and kept a curling photograph of the old man taped inside his locker door. Between them, those two had put more of the city together than the city would ever think to thank them for, and they punched a clock and drove home to ordinary houses and never once stood waiting for a stranger to be impressed. Gus's story came to me in pieces over those evenings, most of it from Eddie. The old man had set the structural steel into the children's wing of the very hospital where, decades on, half the crew's own grandchildren would be born. Eddie liked to point that out, that the people Gus had hired were now trusting their families' lives to bones Gus had laid. There was a bridge up the valley that Vance Steel held up. There was a school. There was, Eddie told me once with a fierce, quiet pride, not one job in 41 years where a Vance piece ever came back. Not one failure. That was the whole family religion, and Daniel had inherited it intact, that the work was a promise made to people you would never meet, and that you sign the promise with a stamp by hand so that in 80 years they would know a person had stood right there and gotten it right. I held that little steel die again one of those nights, turning it over while Sal told a story about Gus stressing down a supplier over a load of bar stock that looked fine and wasn't, and something in my chest settled in a way it never had at my father's table. I had grown up in rooms where the entire point was to look fine. Out on the flats, in the cut metal smell and the church bell ring of honest steel, looking fine was nearly an insult. The only thing anyone cared about was whether the thing would hold when the full weight finally came down on it. I didn't understand the size of what Daniel had those first months, and I want to be clear that I'm glad I didn't. He drove a clean but ordinary truck. He wore the coveralls because he was on the floor most days by choice. He answered his own phone. I knew the shop did structural work, and I knew he carried a lot of people on his payroll because he worried out loud about their health insurance more than he worried about anything in his own life. I assumed, the way you assume about a man with grease in his knuckles, that we were two people of roughly the same modest size, and I was glad of it, the way you're glad of cool water. I had spent my whole life being measured. With Daniel, for the first time, nobody anywhere near me was holding a ruler. What I didn't yet know was that the quiet man I was falling for had spent the previous decade turning Gus's single-rented bay into one of the largest privately held structural steel fabricators on the coast, and that he had done it without ever once feeling the need to tell anyone, least of all the family that was about to decide, on the strength of a glance at his hands, that he was worth nothing at all. I brought Daniel home for the first time at a Sunday dinner, and I knew within 90 seconds that it was going to go badly because my father's eyes did the thing. They went to the shoes, then the watch, then the hands. Daniel had cleaned up, pressed shirt, the one good jacket, but you cannot scrub a working man's hands all the way clean, and my father caught the faint dark lines around the knuckles and, in that single downward glance, quietly rewrote every other thing about him. He was polite. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. My father didn't sneer across the table. He asked Daniel what he did, and when Daniel said, "I run a fabrication shop, structural steel, mostly," my father nodded the precise nod you give a child's crayon drawing and said, "Honest work." 2 words, delivered warmly, that managed to close and lock a door. Whitney leaned in with a smile that had teeth set into it and asked whether Daniel was the owner, or more the hands-on type, and Daniel said, truthfully and without a flicker, "Both, I suppose. I like the floor." My mother changed the subject to Preston's promotion before the sentence had finished cooling. Daniel didn't correct any of it. He passed the potatoes and asked my father a real question about the waterway rezoning, and my father answered it like a man explaining the ocean to a fish. In the car afterward, I asked Daniel why he hadn't said more, why he let them shrink him like that, and he just rolled his shoulders once and said, "They didn't ask because they wanted to know me, Cora. They asked to place me. No sense handing a man a measurement he's already taken." Something in my chest went very still when he said it, because it was the truest sentence anyone had ever spoken about my family, and he'd assembled it from one dinner and a downward glance. It got worse after that, but slowly, the way the tide comes in over the flats. You don't see it move, you just look up and the ground you were standing on is gone. My mother started referring to Daniel, when she believed I was out of earshot, as Cora's mechanic. Not even unkindly. That was the maddening part of it. She said it the way you'd name someone's hobby. At my cousin's baby shower, an aunt asked, brightly, how the handyman was getting on, and 3 women near the punch laughed in a way that wasn't quite laughing, and my face went hot and then very cold. Whitney took to introducing me. At the parties I still got dragged to, as her sister, who's doing her own thing out on the flats, in a tone you'd use for a relative who'd joined a commune. When the engagement happened, my father called me into his office, the one with his name in the lobby stone, and gave me what he plainly believed was a loving, fatherly talk. He came around the desk so it wouldn't feel like a meeting, which somehow made it worse. "I'm not telling you he's a bad man," he said. "I'm sure he's perfectly decent. But a marriage is a long road, Cora, and you have to think about which doors stay open and which ones quietly close. You're a thorn. There are expectations on you that you didn't ask for. I understand that, but they're real, and they don't go away because you'd like them to. This isn't about money. It's about judgment. When you marry, you're representing this whole family, and people will read your judgment off the man standing next to you." He said it gently, his hand warm on my shoulder. He believed every syllable. That's the thing I could never get him to understand later, that the gentlest version of contempt is still contempt, and that "I only want what's best for you" can be the cruelest sentence in the language when best means smaller, quieter, more like us. I told him I was marrying Daniel anyway. He told me, still gently, still with his hand on my shoulder, that if I did, I'd be doing it without the family's support. "And you ought to understand what that means in practical terms, financially," he added, because in his world money and love lived in the same desk drawer, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. I said I understood. My hands were cold the entire drive home, both of them locked on the wheel, but I did understand. I understood better than he knew. The rehearsal dinner is the night it stopped being gentle, and I'm not going to put his exact words in your ears, because some sentences are designed to hurt, and I won't hand them around twice. He had insisted on hosting it, which should have warned me, because hosting let him seat his investors and partners at the family table while Daniel's people, his shop foreman, the aunt who'd helped raise him after his folks passed, the 2 welders who'd been at Vance Fab for 30 years apiece, got drifted toward the far end like an afterthought. The wine was expensive. The toasts were all about the thorns. And then, somewhere into the second bottle, my father rose with his glass and said the kind of thing a man cannot take back, that the person I loved was nothing and would always be nothing, that if I went through with this I would leave with nothing, and that I shouldn't expect to still carry his name by morning. He said it to the whole table. He said it like a verdict. The room went the specific silence of 40 people deciding, all at once, to study their plates. I felt the blood drain out of my face. And Daniel set down his fork, and in a voice that did not rise even a half step, said, "That's all right, sir. She's not marrying you." Then he picked the fork back up and went on with his meal. Down at the afterthought end of the table, Gus's old aunt made a small sound that might have been a laugh. She'd had the manners to swallow. We married 11 days later, on the water down at Owen Beach, in a short ceremony with a borrowed arch and the wind coming hard off the sound, hard enough that we had to weight the programs down with stones from the tide line. Hector's whole crew came in their good shirts, scrubbed and uncomfortable and beaming. Marisol stacked Conscious and Pan Dulce on a folding table until the legs bowed. Eddie brought his wife. Sal brought a toast he had plainly rewritten 4 times on a card he kept patting in his pocket. It was nothing my mother would have recognized as a wedding. No seating chart, no swans, no quartet, and it was the warmest room I have ever stood inside, even out in the open with the wind going. There were 2 empty chairs in the front. I'd had them set out anyway, some stubborn part of me refusing to pretend my parents had never existed, and they sat there all afternoon, white and vacant, catching the wind off the water. I won't tell you it didn't put a stone in my throat to look at them, because it did. But here is the part one never saw coming. When it came time for someone to walk me down the short stretch of packed sand, and there was no father there to do it, Sal stood up without anyone asking him to. 31 years at the shop, forearms like mooring lines, in a shirt he'd ironed himself and ironed badly, and he held out his arm to me and said low, "Come on, bookkeeper. Let's go get you married." My eyes burned so hard I could barely make out the arch. He walked me down that sand as steady as a set beam, handed me across to Daniel without one word, and went and sat back down beside Eddie, and the two old welders watched us say our vows the way they'd watch a weld they fully intended to stand behind. Daniel's vow was short, because he was not a man of long speeches. He said he couldn't promise me a big life, but he could promise me a true one, that whatever he built with me would be built to hold, and that he would put his name on it and mean it. I don't remember a word of what I said back. I remember that my hands were steady for the first time in months, that the two empty chairs went on catching the wind behind me the whole time, and that I had never once in my life felt less poor. Whitney sent a text that said she couldn't be in the middle of it, and a gift card she clearly believed was generous. My father made good on the financial part with a crispness I almost admired. There was a trust I'd been told about my whole life, always vague, always someday, and a lawyer's letter informed me that I had been removed as a beneficiary, that the decision was final, and that he wished me well. The letter called it the family's collective decision, which was how my father liked to make a thing he had decided entirely alone sound like weather rolling and off the sound. My mother stopped calling. At the grocery store, I would catch people who'd known us my whole life looking at me with the soft, terrible pity people save for a young woman they're sure has thrown her life into the water. I ran into my mother once during those months, in the cereal aisle of the grocery store up on the north end, and it was worse than any amount of shouting could have been. She looked at my cart, store-brand coffee, the cheap eggs, the one nice thing I'd allowed myself, and I watched her run my father's arithmetic across it, the quick downward inventory, the silent total. She didn't say anything cruel. She asked, gently, whether I was managing all right, in the tone you'd use with someone just out of the hospital. I told her I was happy. "I know you think you are, sweetheart," she said, and reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear the way she had when I was small, and for 1 second I was sure something was finally going to break open between us. Then she said, "It isn't too late, you know. Your father isn't an unreasonable man. He only wants to see you make a sensible choice. We all do.
We've talked about it.
We just want you back in your real life." My real life. As though the one I was living were a costume I'd put on to spite them. I told her I was in my real life, that it had grease under its nails and had been kinder to me than this family ever was. Her face didn't turn angry. It turned into something worse than angry, soft and certain and grieving, the face of a woman watching a daughter refuse a rope she was sure would save her. "All right," she said. "When you're ready, then." She kissed my cheek, turned her cart toward the registers, and left me standing in the cereal aisle with my hands gone cold around the cart handle, understanding for the first time that you cannot argue a person out of a measurement they take with their whole heart. They weren't monsters. That's the thing I could never make anyone outside the family believe. They lovingly, completely, sincerely believed I had ruined my life, and there is no argument you can win against people who are certain they are rescuing you. Here is the thing I need you to sit with, though, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. I was not ruined. My father could not conceive of that. In his arithmetic, cutting me off from the thorn money was the same as cutting off my heir, because he genuinely could not picture a human life that wasn't being held up from underneath by something he had provided. He had no earthly idea what I'd married into, because in 2 years he had never once asked. He'd seen the coveralls and stopped looking, the way he'd turned over a county math medal and set it down. And Daniel, who could have ended the entire long performance at any dinner with a single calm sentence about what Vance fabrication actually was, who could have flattened my father with the truth any time he chose, had decided, out of a kind of dignity I am still learning from, to simply let my family go on measuring him wrong. I asked him about that the night before the wedding. We were at our own kitchen table, and he had Gus's old stamp out, turning it over in his fingers the way some men worry a coin. I asked him if it ever made him want to just say it, to set the record straight, to watch their faces. He thought about it for a while. Then he said, "If your worth depends on them being impressed, Cora, then it was never really yours to begin with. It was theirs. They could give it and they could take it back." He set the stamp down between us on the table. "Mine's not for sale, and it's not on loan. I'd rather they never know than know for the wrong reason." My eyes burned and my throat closed, and I didn't trust my voice enough to answer him, so I just put my hand over his, and we sat there a while with the little steel die between us. I went quiet, the way I always had. But quiet, it turns out, is not the same thing as gone. 8 months later, my father opened the proudest building of his life. He'd been talking about the Meridian for years before a single shovel touched the dirt, 26 stories on the best parcel left on the waterway, the tower that was going to be the period at the end of the long sentence that was Thorn Development. I'd heard him describe it at holidays back when I was still invited to holidays. The height of it, the glass, the way it would catch the evening light coming off the water so the whole east face would burn gold at sunset. It was the building he wanted his name remembered by. The grand opening was a 400-person affair. Investors, city officials, the people whose photographs run in the business section, a string quartet tucked into the corner of the lobby, a podium, a ribbon the width of a two-lane road. My father had a real gift for this part. The man could throw an evening that made you feel you were standing inside history while it was being poured. I almost didn't go. I hadn't been invited, of course. 8 months of silence doesn't come with an invitation. But Daniel had been invited, and I didn't understand why until the afternoon of, when he came out of the bedroom in a charcoal suit I had never once seen him wear, a real one, beautifully cut, and handed me a heavy cream envelope with both our names written together on the inside flap. "Vance did the structural package on this one," he said, the way another man might mention it looked like rain. "The frame, the connections, the whole skeleton, top to bottom. Developer always invites the principal contractors to the opening. It's just how it's done." He paused, and for the first time looked almost unsure. "You don't have to come, Cora. I know whose building it is. But I'd like you next to me when I walk in, if you're willing." My hands went still around the envelope. I had spent 8 months assuming my father's great monument had nothing whatsoever to do with us, and the truth had been sitting in our own garage the entire time, a worn steel die and a coffee can on the workbench, stamped into every column holding the thing up. We walked in together, and I am going to remember the next part in slow, particular detail for the rest of my life. The drive over was the longest 15 minutes I have ever sat through. Daniel didn't fill it with talk. That was never his way. He just reached across at a red light and laid his hand over mine where it sat on my knee, his thumb finding the old steel die callus he had never quite worn off, and he held it there until the light went green. I kept thinking I ought to tell him to turn the truck around. I kept not saying it. Part of me was certain my father would have us turned away at the door, invitation or no, and part of me, a part one wasn't proud of and couldn't quiet, simply wanted, after 2 years of being looked at the wrong way in grocery aisles, to be in the room, not to do a single thing. Just to be there, on Daniel's arm, in a building I now knew my own husband had set the bones of, and to let that be true in front of people for once in my life. We parked 3 blocks out, because the valet line was a slow river of cars, each worth more than my apartment building. Walking up, I could see the Meridian doing the exact thing my father had promised, years before, that it would do. The whole east face lit gold from the inside, glowing out over the black water, like something that had simply decided to exist. It was, and I will give him this freely, a beautiful building. My father had imagined a beautiful thing, and willed it up into the sky. He had only failed to ask, even once, whose hands had made it stand there. My own hands were cold, and my heart was going hard against my ribs by the time we reached the doors, and Daniel squeezed my fingers once and said, "Whatever happens in there, we walk back out together." Then we went in. My father was up near the podium, working the room the way he worked rooms, a hand landing on this shoulder and that one, his laugh pitched precisely to carry to the edges. He turned mid-sentence and saw me. I watched the recognition arrive in stages. Asterisk Cora. Here. How? Asterisk. And then his eyes slid to the man at my side, the man in the beautiful charcoal suit with the impossibly steady hands, and I watched his whole face refuse the information it was receiving. Daniel Vance. The grease-stained nobody. At his investor opening. In a suit that fit like that. Holding a principal contractor's invitation with both our names on it. My father's face did the one thing I had never seen it do in 33 years of studying it. It stopped. Just stopped, the way a clock stops. The social machinery that always knew the next thing to say simply went dark behind his eyes. The glass in his hand paused halfway to the little cocktail table beside him and never quite finished the trip. He set it down by feel, blind, his gaze locked on Daniel. A man 2 feet away kept talking to him, and my father didn't hear a single word of it. The color went out of his face from the top down, like water draining from a glass. Across the lobby, Whitney spotted us, and her smile dropped off her face the way something physically falls. My mother, beside her, brought one hand flat against her own sternum and left it there. The quartet kept playing its bright little circle of music. 400 people kept drinking and laughing and admiring the view, and at the dead center of all of it my father stood frozen by his own podium, finally doing the arithmetic he had refused to do for 2 years, and arriving, far too late, at a number that frightened him. He didn't get to control what happened next, and I think that's the part that truly came apart in him. My father's entire life had been the careful management of how things looked. And the one moment he most needed to manage was about to be narrated for him, on a microphone, in front of every single person he had invited there to admire him. The program began. The building's lead architect stepped to the podium, a precise, unhurried woman named Ms. Okafor, who had no idea in the world that any family drama existed in that room and was simply doing the ceremonial part of her evening. She walked the crowd through the tower. She talked about the design language, the curtain wall, the way the east face had been angled to catch the light off the water, the gold at sunset my father had described to me years before, when I was still a daughter. And then she said the thing that ceremonies always say, the thing my father had clearly never once imagined could become a problem. A building like this isn't a drawing, she said, easy and warm, a person who loved her craft. It's steel. 26 stories don't stand on a vision. They stand on a frame, and a frame is only ever as good as the people who fabricate it. We were fortunate on the Meridian. The entire structural package was handled by a firm that's been making the city's skeletons for 3 generations, one of the largest privately held fabricators on the coast, and rare in this business for still being owner-operated, with its principal on the shop floor most days of the week. I'd like to recognize the head of Vance Fabrication, who's with us tonight. She found him in the crowd, the way you find the one person who isn't trying to be found. Daniel, would you stand? 400 heads turned. Daniel stood, gave one short nod, and sat back down. The way a man stands when his grandfather's name is read aloud, briefly and without ceremony, because the name is the thing, not the standing. The applause that followed was real, and it was loud because investors clap hardest for the people who turn the thing they put money into a thing that actually holds. And I'll tell you who I looked for, in the middle of all that applause. Not my father. I found Sal and Eddie. They were standing near the back of the lobby, by the preserved column, the same 2 men my father had drifted to the far end of a rehearsal table 8 months earlier, like place settings he had run out of room for. Sal had his big arms crossed and his chin lifted, and Eddie had that photograph of Gus look on his face, and when the architect spoke the firm's name out loud into that gold-lit room, neither of them cheered or gloated or even smiled very wide. They only stood a little straighter, the way a man stands when somebody finally says out loud the thing he has known with his own 2 hands his entire working life. Sal caught my eye across the crowd and gave me one small nod, the very same nod he'd given me on the beach before he walked me down the sand, and my throat closed up so hard I had to drop my gaze to the floor. 41 years of stamping a name into steel nobody ever thanked them for, and here at last was a room full of the city's important people, up on their feet, for the work itself. Gus would have hated every bit of the fuss and loved the reason for it. And my father stood 12 feet from that podium and learned, at the exact same instant as the entire room, that the grease-stained nobody he had disowned his only quiet daughter for marrying was the owner of the company whose steel was holding up the tower with his own name on the deed. I watched it land on him. I watched him understand that every beam above his head, every column running up through all 26 floors, every connection bearing the weight of his great monument, had crossed a shop floor and been struck, by hand, with a small mark. AV inside a gear. Pressed there by the same people he had drifted down to the afterthought end of a rehearsal table. Then Ms. Okafor, who genuinely had no idea she was finishing anyone off, added the detail that closed it for good, that there was a tradition at Vance Fabrication, going back 41 years, of hand-stamping the very first erected column of every major project, and that the crew had stamped the meridians the cold morning the frame first went up. She gestured, almost charmingly, toward the far wall of the lobby, where a polished section of that first column had been preserved behind glass and mounted as a design feature, a piece of raw structural steel under museum lighting, the Vance mark clear and deliberate on its face. A feature my father had reviewed and approved for his own lobby, signed off on with pride, without ever once knowing whose name it carried up the side of his building. Daniel never said a word into a microphone. He didn't gloat, he didn't so much as smile wide. He didn't have to. The room did every bit of it for him, and that's the part one keep coming back to all this time later. I had spent 2 years bracing for the moment I'd finally get to say something sharp to my father, rehearsing lines in the shower like an idiot, sharpening them and putting them away. And when the moment actually came, I didn't need a single one of them. The truth had been built into the building. All anyone ever had to do was read it out loud. He found me afterward, near the preserved column, while the crowd thinned toward the bar. His hands were not steady. I could see it, the slight tremor as he reached toward the glass case, and then thought better of touching it. He looked at the little stamped mark behind the glass and then at me, and for the first time in my entire life my father did not seem to know where to put his eyes. "I didn't know," he said. "It came out rough, scraped. Cora." I didn't know what the shop. "I know you didn't," I said. My voice came out level. I'd half expected it to fail me, and it didn't. "You never asked." That was the whole of it. For words and a little more, and then I was finished. Grandma Halvorsen would have approved of the economy of it. She never spent 11 words where 4 would settle the drawer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for any of the sharp things I'd saved up. I just let my father stand there in front of the one thing he had refused, for 2 years, to look at, and let the looking do its work. I didn't stay to watch him absorb it. There's a temptation in a moment like that one, to linger, to stand inside your own vindication and warm your hands on it. But I kept hearing my grandmother on the subject of 11 cents, on being the kind of person you are when nobody is making you be it, and the truth is I had no wish to become a woman who fed on a father's worst night, even that night. I found Daniel by the coat check. He raised one eyebrow, a small and private question. "Are you all right? Do you want to go?" And I nodded and we left. No scene. No speech. We walked back out the gold-lit doors and into the cold coming off the water, the same 2 people who had walked in, and the valet brought the ordinary truck around while 100 polished cars idled and waited their turn, and not one person in the line seemed to think that was strange anymore. In the truck, Daniel didn't ask me how I felt, which I loved him for more than I can tell you. He turned the heater on and let it run, and after a while he said, "Sal is going to dine out on tonight for a solid year." And I laughed, a real one, the first all night, something in my chest finally letting go of a grip it had held for 2 years, and said yes, he was, and that Eddie would pretend he hadn't enjoyed a minute of it, and that all of us would know better. We drove home along the water with the radio turned low. When we got in, Daniel set his keys on the kitchen table beside Gus's old stamp, the way he set them down every night of his life, and asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. We didn't talk about my father again that night. We didn't need to. The building was going to say it for him every single day for the rest of his. You can't unring that kind of bell, and you especially can't do it in a room full of the exact people whose opinion a man like my father lives and dies on. It moved fast after that, the way these things do once they tip. By the end of that night, Half the investors in the lobby had quietly worked out that Roland Thorne had disowned his own daughter for marrying a man those same investors had just risen to applaud, a man whose firm any one of them would have been thrilled to land for their next groundbreaking. Standing in my father's world is a current, and it runs in one direction right up until the moment it doesn't. People who had hung on his every sentence a year before began returning his calls a little slower, and then a little slower than that. A development group that had been very close on his next parcel went cool, and then went quietly elsewhere, and the elsewhere, I heard later, had specifically asked whether Vance Fabrication might be free for the structural package. There was no scheme to a single piece of it. Daniel never lifted one finger against the man. The market simply did the thing markets do once they decide that someone's judgment is poorer than they'd assumed. I watched the current turn with my own eyes, once. A few weeks after the opening, Daniel and I were at a supply yard out on the flats picking up something that didn't matter, and a man in a very good coat came across the gravel toward us with his hand already out. One of my father's longest-standing investors, a man who at that rehearsal dinner had studied his plate as hard as everyone else while my father said his piece. Now here he was, crossing a muddy supply yard to shake the hand of the man he'd watched get cut off. He didn't mention the dinner. Men like that never do. He told Daniel he'd heard wonderful things, that he had a project coming up, that he would love to get Vance in early on the structural side, and he pressed a business card into Daniel's grease-stained hand with the eagerness of a man placing a bet he should have placed a year ago. Daniel took the card, thanked him politely, and slid it into his coverall pocket with the day's receipts. After the man had walked off, Daniel looked at me, and for a second neither of us said anything, and then he said, mild as milk, "Funny how the hands work now." That was the entire sum of his commentary on the total reversal of his social standing in my father's world. Funny how the hands work now. I'm not sure I ever loved him more than I did in that gravel lot. He hadn't been keeping score. He had never once been keeping score. The world had simply finished catching up to a measurement he had taken of himself a long time before and had never needed a single other soul to confirm. Whitney stopped telling people I was her sister, doing her own thing out on the flats, and started, awkwardly, telling them we'd always been so close. My mother sent a long message that used the word miscommunication for separate times and never once arrived at the word that would have mattered. None of it was an apology exactly, because the Thornes have never had the muscle for that particular lift, but it was as close as their bodies could come to bending, and I noted it, and I didn't answer right away. And then, about 5 months after the opening, my father called Daniel. Not me, Daniel. He'd swallowed enough to dial the number of the man he had once called nothing. Thorne Development had a tower stalled out. A financing partner had walked. The fabricator on the job had defaulted mid-frame, and the whole project was sitting half-built and bleeding, carrying costs by the week. The kind of stall that can pull a developer's whole reputation down into the hole with it. He needed steel. He needed bonding. He needed, above all, a firm whose name on the job would steady the nerves of the people he still owed money and explanations. He needed, in plain words, the one firm everyone now wanted and almost no one could get. I was standing at our kitchen counter when Daniel took the call, and I heard my father's voice come small and thin through the phone, and I heard him say the word I had never once in my life heard him use toward either of us. "Please, please. We need you on this one. I'll make the terms work however you want them." Daniel listened to the whole of it without interrupting. I keep telling you he never gloated because it is the entire point of the man. When my father finally ran out of words, Daniel was quiet a moment, and then he said, evenly, "We'll take a look at the drawings. If the job's sound, we'll bid it like we'd bid anyone's. Not a yes, not a no, not a weapon and not a gift. Just a working man treating a desperate one with more fairness than that man had ever once shown him." Then he set the phone down on the table next to Gus's old stamp, and he asked me what I wanted for dinner. We did end up doing the work, in the end, on ordinary terms, because Daniel decided the building deserved to get finished, and the framers and electricians counting on that paycheck deserved it a great deal more than my father deserved to be left twisting. My father knows now, exactly and in public, what the man he disowned is worth. He learned it the only way men like him ever seemed to, out loud, in a room full of the people he most wanted to impress, with the truth stamped by hand into steel he was already standing on. I think about my grandmother's line nearly every day now, the one about how most people spend their whole lives confusing the price tag with the thing. My father read the surface his entire life and called it the substance, and it cost him a daughter for 2 years and a great deal more than that by the end. You can measure a person by their shoes and their watch and the dark lines that won't scrub out of their knuckles, or you can do the harder, slower thing and actually ask them what they've built with their hands. One of those ways is faster. The other one is the only one that has ever once been right. That's my story. A green cloth ledger, a steel stamp the size of my thumb, and a tower my father will look up at for the rest of his life, knowing exactly whose name is holding the whole thing together. So, I want to hear from you. If you had been standing 12 feet from that podium when the architect read your husband's name into the microphone, would you have said the 4 words I said and let it lie, or would you have walked over to your father and said nothing at all? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.